In the summer of 1887, a 17-year-old girl stood at the altar of a small Methodist church high in the mountains of southwestern Virginia. The wedding dress she wore, already yellowed with age, had been passed down and worn by 3 generations of women in her family. Yet, this was no joyous celebration. The congregation sat in a stiff, uncomfortable silence as the trembling, pale girl, her eyes fixed on the wooden floor, prepared to marry her first cousin. The same blood that flowed in her veins flowed in his. Her future was about to be claimed by the same twisted family tree that had already claimed the minds of her siblings. What happened next would cement itself as the darkest secret in Appalachian folklore. Even today, over a century later, the descendants of that mountain community refuse to speak her name out loud, a secret so profoundly disturbing. Hello everyone. Before we dive in, please be sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below with what time and where you're watching from. This ensures YouTube will continue showing you stories just like this one. The Twisted Inheritance. The girl's name was Temperance Mullins, or simply Tempe to most folks. She was born into what outsiders diplomatically called an isolated mountain family, but the reality was far more sinister. The Mullins clan had practiced intermarriage for more than a century, a practice that originated not from religious conviction or tradition, but from something far darker: control, greed, and an unrelenting need to keep their secrets buried beneath the Virginia soil. Tempe's grandfather, Ezekiel Mullins, was the one who established this twisted legacy back in the 1790s when he relocated his 3 wives, yes, 3, to a remote hollow that would eventually bear his name. 2 of those wives were his own nieces. By the time Tempe was born in 1870, the genetic damage was starkly visible in every generation. Her uncle Jeremiah was born with 6 fingers on each hand and spoke in garbled sentences only family members could decipher. Her Aunt Charity suffered from such violent seizures that she had to be chained to a chair during the worst episodes. Her own brother, Moses, had never learned to walk correctly, spending his brief life crawling across the cabin floors like a wounded animal. But the heaviest burden would fall upon Tempe. She was born with a sharp intelligence that seemed to skip randomly through the Mullins bloodline like a cruel joke. Along with striking blue eyes and auburn hair, she was beautiful. The family elders saw her beauty not as a gift but as currency. Her fate was decided when she was just 5 years old. She would marry her cousin Absalom, Ezekiel's great-grandson, to maintain the family's concentrated land holdings and to keep their pure blood intact. The outside world would recognize what they called purity as something far more horrifying. The arrangement was sealed with a simple handshake while Tempe was still learning to read. Absalom was already 18, a hulking figure bearing the trademark Mullins features, a heavy brow, deep-set eyes, and hands so massive they looked like they belonged to a different species. With the patience of a predator, he watched Tempe grow up, knowing she belonged to him by family decree. Tempe, indoctrinated to believe that questioning family decisions meant eternal damnation, accepted her fate with the resignation of someone already dead inside. The weight of anticipation. As Tempe grew, the weight of her predetermined future began to crush her spirit in ways no child should ever have to endure. By the age of 12, she had witnessed enough family horrors to fully grasp what awaited her. Her cousin Martha had married their mutual uncle 2 years prior, and the nighttime screaming from their cabin echoed through the hollow like the cries of a tortured animal. Martha's first baby was born without eyes. The second never drew a breath. The third lived for 6 agonizing months, its body twisted into unnatural shapes. Tempe began keeping a secret diary, concealed beneath a loose floorboard in her room. The entries, discovered decades later by a local historian, revealed the mind of a brilliant young woman slowly being driven insane by her circumstances. Absalom watches me during meals now, she wrote at 13. His eyes follow me like I am already his property. Mother says it is natural for a man to claim what belongs to him. But the way he looks at me makes my skin feel like it is crawling with insects. The Mullins family operated under a twisted interpretation of biblical law, ignoring most Christian doctrine while cherry-picking verses to justify their practices. Tempe's father, Obadiah, was also her great-uncle, the product of his own parents' incestuous union. He preached to his children about the sanctity of keeping bloodlines clean. Yet, his sermons were often interrupted by violent coughing fits that sprayed blood across the cabin walls. The genetic deterioration was literally eating him alive from the inside. By 14, Tempe's beauty seemed almost supernatural against her family's physical decline. Visitors, the few brave enough to venture into Mullins' territory, would later describe her as looking like an angel trapped in hell. But her beauty only amplified the desperation of her situation. Absalom's obsession intensified daily, and the family elders began finalizing preparations for the wedding that would seal both their fates. The psychological torture was calculated and methodical. Every family gathering served as a reminder of her future. Absalom would sit beside her during meals, his massive hands occasionally brushing her arm in gestures everyone pretended were accidental. He would bring her gifts, carved wooden trinkets, wildflowers, and once, a locket that had belonged to his mother, while the family cooed over his courtship as if it were a normal romance, not a countdown to sanctioned rape. Tempe's diary entries from this time show a young woman frantically seeking escape routes that didn't exist. "I dream of running away to Richmond," she wrote. "But father says the outside world would never accept a girl like me. He says our blood is too precious to waste on strangers, and that God has chosen this path for me. But if God is real, why does he make my stomach turn to stone every time Absalom speaks my name?" The final act of defiance. When Tempe turned 16, something inside her snapped. The passive acceptance that had been drilled into her since childhood broke, giving way to a fierce, desperate rebellion that took the entire Mullins clan by surprise. It started subtly, refusing to sit next to Absalom at dinner, turning her face away when he tried to speak, and spending hours walking alone where his bulk couldn't follow her through the narrow mountain paths. But in the Mullins household, small acts of defiance were treated like capital crimes. Her father's response was brutal and swift. The beatings began immediately, but they were carefully calculated not to damage the merchandise that would soon belong to Absalom. Obadiah would force her to kneel on dried corn kernels for hours while reciting Bible verses about obedience. When she refused to eat beside her intended husband, they locked her in the root cellar for 3 days with only stagnant water and moldy bread. The message was clear: resistance would meet escalating punishment until she completely submitted. Yet, Tempe's rebellion only grew stronger. She wrote in her diary, "They think they can break me like they broke Martha, like they broke all the others. But there is something different in my blood, something that won't bend. I would rather die than let Absalom touch me with those grotesque hands. I would rather burn alive than carry his twisted children." These were not the words of a typical 16-year-old, they were the desperate vows of a girl preparing for war. Her most daring action occurred in the spring of 1886. A traveling preacher named Samuel Hartwell arrived in the nearby town of Wise, and word spread that he was performing quick marriages for couples from the surrounding hollows. Tempe saw this as her chance for escape. If she could quickly convince another man to marry her, perhaps the family would be forced to honor that prior union. She began sneaking out at night, walking the treacherous paths in the darkness to meet with young men from neighboring families. It was a naive and desperate plan, but it was her only hope. The family discovered her nighttime excursions when Absalom began tracking her. He followed her to a moonlit clearing where she was meeting with Thomas Slump, a 19-year-old from a family the Mullins considered inferior stock. What ensued was witnessed by Tempe's younger sister, Ruth, who had followed them both. According to Ruth's later testimony to a local magistrate, Absalom attacked Thomas with the savage fury of a wild animal protecting its territory. The beating was so severe that Thomas never fully recovered. His left arm remained useless for the rest of his life, and his speech was permanently slurred due to head trauma. The message Absalom intended to send was received by every young man in the county: Tempe Mullins was claimed territory, and anyone who interfered would face consequences far worse than a simple fight. Word spread quickly through the mountain communities that the Mullins girl was cursed, and associating with her meant inviting violence into your home. Tempe's final hope for escape was crushed, and the family's response to her defiance was about to enter a new, far more horrifying phase. The wedding that became a funeral. After the incident with Thomas Slump, the Mullins family decided that Tempe's rebellious spirit demanded more drastic measures. What followed crossed a line so dark that even by their own twisted standards, it was a new level of cruelty. They began what they termed marriage preparation, a systematic process designed to completely break Tempe's will before the wedding day. The process started with isolation. They moved her from the main cabin to a small, windowless shed used for storing tools. Light came only from a single candle, which was extinguished every night at sunset. They fed her barely enough to survive, stale bread, thin gruel, and water tasting of rust from the old well. But the physical deprivation was nothing compared to the psychological torture. Every day, Absalom was permitted to visit her prison for what the family called courtship sessions. These visits, documented in Tempe's secret diary, were exercises in methodical intimidation. Absalom would describe in graphic detail what their wedding night would be like, how their children would look, and how she would spend the rest of her life serving his needs. He would sit just close enough for her to feel his breath and smell his unwashed body, but he was forbidden from touching her until the wedding, a rule that seemed to terrify her almost as much as it frustrated him. The family also began using examples of resistance. They forced her to spend time with her cousin Martha, who had married their uncle. Martha had been reduced to a hollow-eyed shell who flinched whenever a man entered the room and spoke only in whispers. They made Tempe watch as Martha's latest baby, born with a cleft palate so severe it couldn't nurse, slowly starved to death over 2 weeks. God punishes those who fight against his plan, her mother told her as the infant drew its final breath. This is what happens to ungrateful wives. Perhaps the most insidious part of their campaign was the way they turned her intelligence against her. They would bring her books, rare treasures in the Mullins household, but only those that reinforced their message, religious texts about feminine submission, medical journals claiming inbreeding was scientifically sound, and historical accounts of royal families who married within their bloodlines to maintain power. They desperately wanted her to rationalize her fate, to convince herself that what was happening was not only inevitable but somehow noble. The psychological pressure began to take its toll. Tempe's diary entries from this period show her grip on reality beginning to slip. "Maybe they are right," she wrote in shaking handwriting. "Maybe I am being selfish to resist. Maybe God really does want this for me, and my rebellion is the sin, not their plans." Yet, even as she wrote these words of surrender, something deeper in her psyche was planning one final, desperate act of defiance. The curse spoken aloud. The wedding date was set for July 15, 1887, exactly 1 month after her 17th birthday. The family began preparations for what they promised would be the most important day in Mullins family history, unaware that their carefully planned ceremony was about to become something entirely different. The morning of July 15, 1887, was gray and oppressive, with storm clouds gathering over the Virginia mountains like an omen. Tempe had not slept for 3 days. Her final diary entry, written in barely legible, shaky handwriting, read, "Today I become something I was never meant to be. But they will not have my soul. That belongs to me alone, and I will take it with me to whatever comes next." If you're still watching, you are already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, if this were your bloodline, what would you have done? The Mullins family invited every relative within a 50-mile radius to witness what they proclaimed to be the perfect union of their bloodline. Over 60 people crowded into the small Methodist church in Pound, Virginia. The guest list was a genealogical nightmare of siblings who were literally cousins, mothers who were simultaneously aunts, and fathers who were also grandfathers. Tempe walked down the aisle on her father's arm, the same father who was also her great-uncle, wearing the yellowed wedding gown. It had been worn by her mother, her grandmother, and her great-grandmother before her. Each woman had been forced into marriage with a blood relative, passing the dress down like a curse rather than a blessing. The silk, once white, was the color of old bones, reeking of accumulated tears and mothballs. Witnesses later described her appearance as otherworldly. She had lost so much weight during her imprisonment that the dress hung on her like a burial shroud. Her bright blue eyes had taken on a glassy, distant quality that made her look as though she was already dead. Some swore they felt a chill when she passed their pews, as if she were trailing something cold and unnatural. Absalom waited at the altar, a mountain of flesh barely contained in his wedding suit. At 25, his excitement had manifested in an appetite that added another 50 pounds to his massive frame. His hands, the grotesquely oversized appendages that haunted Tempe's nightmares, shook visibly. It wasn't nervousness, it was the savage satisfaction and barely controlled lust of a predator finally claiming its prey. The ceremony began normally enough with the elderly preacher, a Mullins cousin who had officiated dozens of these incestuous unions, reading from a family Bible. But something was wrong with Tempe. When the vows began, her responses came out as inaudible whispers. Asked to repeat her words louder, she opened her mouth, but no sound emerged. The congregation began to murmur, sensing something was terribly amiss. Then, as the preacher asked if she took Absalom to be her lawfully wedded husband, Tempe did something that no one in that church had ever witnessed. She lifted her head, looked directly into Absalom's eyes, and spoke her final words as a free woman. "I curse this union," Tempe declared, her voice carrying through the church with a clarity that made every person feel as if ice water had been poured down their spine. "I curse this family, and I curse every child that comes from this twisted bloodline. You have stolen my life, but you will never own my death." The congregation erupted in horrified whispers and shocked gasps, but Tempe was not finished. From the folds of that cursed wedding dress, she produced a small glass vial, later identified as containing a mixture of nightshade and foxglove she had somehow gathered during her brief moments of freedom in the woods. Before anyone could react, before Absalom could stop her, she drank the entire contents in one swift motion. The effect was almost immediate. Tempe's body began convulsing violently, her back arching as the poison coursed through her system. Even as she collapsed to the church floor, her eyes remained fixed on Absalom with an expression of such pure, concentrated hatred that he actually stumbled backward from the altar. Several witnesses later claimed that in her final moments, Tempe's lips moved, but the only person who could hear her words was her intended husband. What she whispered to him became part of Mullins' family law, though Absalom himself never spoke of it publicly. According to his younger brother, who got close enough to hear, Tempe's final words were, "Every night for the rest of your life, you will see my face. Every woman you touch will turn to dust in your hands. The Mullins name dies with me." The lingering legacy. The chaos following her death was unlike anything the mountain community had seen. Some family members screamed that the church was cursed, that God was punishing them. Others insisted Tempe's suicide proved she had been possessed by demons. But the most disturbing reaction came from Absalom, who stood over her lifeless body and began laughing, a terrifying, unhinged sound that cleared the church faster than any fire alarm. In the days immediately following the wedding-turned-funeral, strange events plagued the Mullins family. Their livestock began dying inexplicably, and their crops withered despite adequate rainfall. Several family members reported such vivid and disturbing nightmares that they stopped sleeping altogether. 1 week after the ceremony, Martha, Tempe's cousin, who had been held up as the example of wifely submission, hanged herself from a tree behind her cabin. Her final note read simply, "Tempe was right. Death is better than this." But the most chilling aftermath was Absalom himself. The man who had spent years anticipating his wedding night found himself completely unable to be intimate with any woman after Tempe's death. Every time he tried to touch a potential bride from other families, he was overcome with violent shaking and the look of a man seeing ghosts. He never married, never had children, and spent the remaining 34 years of his life as a recluse in the same cabin where he had planned to bring his child bride. The curse that Tempe had spoken appeared to be taking hold. Within 5 years of her death, the Mullins family bloodline began collapsing in on itself with a brutality and speed that defied natural explanation. The genetic damage that had been accumulating for generations suddenly accelerated, as if Tempe's dying words had awakened something malevolent and dormant in their DNA. Children born after 1887 exhibited deformities so severe that most died within their first year. Those who survived were often mentally incapacitated, deaf, or blind, requiring constant care. The family's carefully maintained records, kept in a leather-bound book that tracked bloodlines like livestock breeding charts, show a pattern of death and disability so consistent it reads like a medical textbook on genetic collapse. By 1900, the once powerful Mullins clan had dwindled to fewer than 20 individuals. Their vast land holdings, accumulated through generations of keeping property within the bloodline, were sold off piece by piece to cover burial and medical expenses. The family cemetery, where Tempe herself was buried in an unmarked grave, became overgrown with thorny vines that seemed to strangle every maintenance attempt. An enduring symbol. The most haunting part of Tempe's legacy was how her story began to spread beyond the family's control. Despite their attempts to suppress what happened, word leaked out, and Tempe became a folk hero to other young women trapped in similar situations. Her name was whispered throughout Appalachia as a symbol of resistance against family tyranny, even if that resistance came at the ultimate price. Modern genealogical research indicates that the Mullins family line effectively ended in the 1920s. The last known descendant, a woman named Prudence Mullins, died childless in a state mental institution in 1934. Her recently uncovered medical records described symptoms remarkably similar to the psychological torment Tempe documented: recurring nightmares of being buried alive, an overwhelming fear of intimate contact, and the unshakable conviction that her family was cursed. But Tempe's story doesn't end with the extinction of her bloodline. In recent years, folklore researchers and paranormal investigators have reported strange phenomena in the area where the family once lived. Visitors to the abandoned church claim to hear wedding bells ringing at precisely 3:17 a.m., the time recorded on her death certificate. Photographers trying to document the ruins often find their images show a young woman in a yellowed wedding dress standing in the background, even when no one was visible when the picture was taken. The most compelling evidence of Tempe's enduring presence comes from local marriage records. Statistical analysis reveals that wedding ceremonies in the counties surrounding the former Mullins territory have an unusually high rate of cancellation or disruption, nearly 3 times the national average. Grooms claim to see apparitions of a young woman shaking her head in warning, brides report sudden, overwhelming dread, and several ceremonies have been halted when one party declared they simply couldn't go through with the marriage. Whether one believes in curses or not, one fact is undeniable. Temperance Mullins, a 17-year-old girl who chose death over submission, successfully destroyed a legacy of abuse that had persisted for over a century. Her final act of defiance didn't just end her own suffering, it ended the suffering of every future generation that would never be born into the Mullins family's twisted web of genetic horror and control. In the end, perhaps that is the most powerful magic of all, the courage to break a cycle of abuse, even when it costs you everything.